To our guest from Finland.
Hello. Okay, let's first set. Only doing the work of game development in Portugal, but the turnover is actually generated through the headquarters in London or some other countries. But we could say that Latvia, Estonia are about the same level. Croatia is having a bigger turnover in their industry. And Lithuania is already over there with their local studios. So perhaps we can say that Latvian industry would benefit from a little bit from the push on business side to really catch up with the Lithuanians and the Croatians. Yeah, if you see the number of employees, it also correlates a lot with the turnover. So more employees, more turnover usually there is. And here you can clearly see the mobile, Finland, Sweden, and then more like PC, console, Romania, Poland difference. And yeah, if we zoom in, you have a similar trend also in number of employees and turnover in this part of the graph here. So again, Latvia with the smallest number of employees has also smallest combined turnover, but more you have employees, more you start to have also turnover in the companies. Makes sense, you need money to pay for the people. So let's have a look on the number of games published in different countries. So in Estonia in 2020 there were 5 companies that published 5 titles. In Lithuania 8 companies that published 24 titles. In Latvia 10 companies that published 17 titles, and in Croatia 38 companies that published 49 titles. And again France with 400 companies publishing more than 1,350 games, of course, is leading there. One of the reasons why the French number is so big, there is also some hyper-casual game developers in the country, of course, making lots of games. And friends, being friends, or they want to record each of them very carefully, so they will be in the collections of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France for the upcoming generations. So if we then have a look on the number of companies in the country and number of companies that publish new games, we can see that there is quite a clear correlation. More companies, more games. And if we zoom in, we can see that, yeah, Baltic countries, the companies perhaps publish a little bit less games than, for example, in Croatia. So again, this depends quite a lot where you are based in. What is the focus of your company? If you are making hyper-casual games, you publish lots more games than if you are making PC titles and so on. But something that we are hearing now from a number of different European countries, that companies are actually publishing less and less games, because first of all, on PC and console, the productions are getting bigger and bigger. And secondly, in mobile, you have game as a service model. So Supercell, for example, has been running their Clash of Clans on Heyday for almost 10 years now, or even more, I don't remember. But so it's basically the same title year after year, getting more content in it. It's a service. So this is a bit unfortunate trend for the Game Awards, because you would like to have new games every year. And if you compare the number of companies that publish new games and number of new titles, you can see that the French number is a bit out of the chart. It should be really going like this. So that's a bit particular case, but when you zoom in, it really nicely follows the track. So there is a certain trend there. So usually you have more games published than you have a number of companies that publish new games. So some of the companies might publish 3 or 4 games during the same year, and many of the companies do not publish any games. And again, the Baltic countries are on the bottom of the chart, so for a number of reasons that I perhaps want to hear from you, why Baltic companies publish less games than perhaps some other that would be interesting to know. So, if we have a look on the historical trends in Croatia, number of video game developer studios has been steadily increasing, same the number of people working in the industry, as well as the turnover of the industry really boomed in 2020 when the COVID pandemic hit the world and people started to play games. In Lithuania, I must remind you that this data is only until 2020, so especially we already can see that the number of people working in the industry is starting to skyrocket. It's getting even bigger in 2021 and 2022. The number of studios is still about the same, and the turnover is only slightly increasing. And Latvia was actually one of the few countries in Europe where the turnover actually decreased in 2020. And that would be interesting to know, like, what's the explanation for that? So please enlighten me. That would be really, really interesting, because the people are actually asking this from me, like, what happened? But there are certain things that might explain the certain challenges Latvia is facing. The first one is, of course, that you need 3 things to actually make it in the games industry. You need talent, you need funding, and you need access to markets. And access to markets is something that EGDF is, of course, working on the European level. We are now working, for example, to push through the platform regulation and opening the mobile application stores for third-party application stores, so that there will be more competing application stores and cloud streaming services for games industry. So it's where you can publish your games. But on the talent side, that is something that happens on the national level. And in Latvia, in 2020 data collection, we only recorded 1 game education institution. In Croatia, you have 2, Estonia 3, Lithuania 3, and Portugal you have 10. And France, and this might be from 2021 number, but anyway, they have 130 educational institutions training game developers. So definitely something to pay attention to is local resources for game education. So the second part is access to funding. And if you have a look on the cultural aid for game productions, most countries, even in Latvia, have some funding for, like, some grants for making games. Many countries, like in Italy, Germany, France, Denmark, Finland, Belgium, have dedicated instruments for game development. And then you have loans in some countries, like in France, and tax credits for bigger productions as well. But if we compare, we can see that in Croatia, situation is same as in Latvia. In Estonia, they have a bit more instruments, and situation in Lithuania and Portugal is about the same. So where you can really start to see the difference is R&D funding. So cultural state aid instruments are mainly for content creation, so actually money for making games. R&D instruments, they are for research for new tools, developing new business models, and so on. And Finland is one of the few countries where you have this kind of funding instruments with Business Finland instruments on development of new business models in games industry and new technologies for games industry. Also France has some dedicated instruments, but Latvia doesn't have any. And that really stands out from this crowd. Estonia has different kind of instruments, Lithuania has them as well as Portugal. Then the third kind of instrument is SME instruments. So SME instruments are for, you know, some money for launching your own game developer studio.
Can you describe what SME means? Because I have no idea.
Small and medium-sized businesses. So basically, when you are first around a game developer studio in Finland, you can apply for this kind of few thousands of euros on just start to run your business, covering all the legal bureaucratic costs, etc., and helping you to become the entrepreneur. And in Latvia, you don't have that kind of support. So it kind of explains your question. But in many countries, in Croatia, you have this kind of support. In Lithuania, you have some loans for new entrepreneurs. In Portugal, you have grants. And yeah, so one of the reasons I would argue that why Latvian industry is struggling so much is that you don't have similar public support as your peers in Estonia or in Lithuania or Portugal or Croatia, for example. But something I would also remind you to keep in mind is that if you are planning to launch this kind of instruments, the single most powerful document guiding the mindset of the industry is the funding application form. So if we look for example cultural state aid instruments, and let's have a look on Denmark, where they have a really good grants for game development. Copenhagen is well known for being this kind of indie hub, making this kind of really nice games, pushing the industry forward. The same for Norway, for example, where the Norwegian Film Fund is investing a lot in this kind of cultural games. They are making really nice games about Sami culture up north, or this kind of art for art's sake games. And that's the mindset of the game developers in Norway, because they are focused on applying this kind of funding. So they are really, really pushing the games industry as a cultural medium forward. But for example, the turnover of the Norwegian industry is not that high. So you can see that the business orientation is perhaps not the strongest in Norway. Whereas in Finland, well, we have very good R&D instruments, not so much funding for the cultural side. And yeah, of course we have Remedy with the Alan Wake and this kind of great cultural AAA games. But perhaps I must admit that Angry Birds is not the most cultural gaming experience there is. So because we have this kind of R&D funding, the Finnish studios are really focused on tech development and business development. So good at making money, but the content direction perhaps is missing. So you need a combination of both of them. And if you go to SME funding, so you have lots of this kind of funding available, for example, in Netherlands. And they are really supporting their indie community. But if you don't have this kind of cultural instruments and R&D instruments to actually build up your business on top of launching your business, it's really hard to grow up. So it's a really, really tricky game of building this kind of support instruments. So, yep. That was a very quick run through my presentation. And I really, really would like to hear your points of views and experiences on especially what happened in 2020 in Latvia. Wow. Why was the Latvian industry decreasing when everyone else was kind of growing that year? And what do you think would be the main messages I should send to European policymakers, like how to support the growth of the Latvian industry?
First of all, a round of applause. And now, is there anyone who would like to take a shot at answering or trying to answer that question? What happened in 2020, aside from COVID pandemic? Anyone dares?
My guess is, like in Latvia, most of the turnover is generated by a couple companies. So if one of those companies had a good year, then it can like really influence the entire industry. So that's my guess, that one or two companies got a good year.
A bad year? I mean, the turnover dropped. Anyone else has a guess what happened? Such silence. All right, any other questions to our speaker today?
Ideas on how the policymakers in Brussels can help you industry grow. Go ahead. What was the question? What can the European policymakers do to help you grow?
Wasn't someone else answering this? Okay, I guess I suppose one point that is sometimes missed is, for example, if we look at the Polish game dev industry, I think they only got serious after someone made a good game, like when Witcher became popular, and then countries started paying attention to grants. So I suppose maybe it's happening in reverse. Maybe Latvia should have some sort of a very popular, ultra famous game which would place us on the world market, and then the governments would think about it. But I feel if there would be... Okay, humor my bullshit. I feel like if there would be a way to get help filling out the European grants stuff, I'm not saying it should depend on Brussels, but this is like top one struggle for me. For example, I cannot just fill the European CEGA, or what was the application thing, Creative Europe thing, properly, because I would need like to spend 2 weeks if I do it like super right. But yeah, like this is the biggest struggle for me right now if I try to get the creative funding for arts games. Like, you know Naves, Anna? Like, this is a fucking good book, right? Like, I imagine the game on it, but I'm in no way I'm investing my money into making something like this right now, because I guess it's super risky. But I would make it if I had money. Like, it's a super great book. Like, it's a like, you all should be proud that this book was written here. Like, Naves, Anna. Sorry.
So I think one of the problems in Latvia is that we don't have good entrepreneurs. So we have game development hobbyists, but except for maybe Game Insight, we have no business people in game development. We do it as a hobby, and it will stay like that until I think the only way we can fix this is going to work for big companies and starting maybe with game development, but also trying to get to the business part and learn, and then come back and make business games as a business. Because games as a hobby is okay, and I support that. But if you ask why there is no game business here, then that's why. Because for us it's just a hobby, and if we want to make business out of it, then we have to learn how.
You used a lot in your statistics blue and red squares. I wanted to ask what is the meaning behind them.
Let's start from there. So the red one was Latvia, and the blue ones were the 5 other countries I was comparing Latvia to. So there was just markers for me to actually find the countries from the charts. Nothing else more special related to that. So the first on the creative, let me first reply and let's continue. So first on the creative Europe part, yeah, you're absolutely correct. There should be more support on actually doing that. And there is actually the creative Europe desks who should be doing that. And that is something that we have been complaining to the European Commission for years now, that in some countries, the creative Europe desks are doing superb job. Like, they're really hands-on helping the studios to actually fill the application forms. Whereas other countries, perhaps the case is to say here in Latvia, you not have a similar level of support. So the European Union should really secure that creative Europe desks are helping the studios in all countries on application forms. Then on the business side, well, it's true that in many countries the kind of public support follows the success. It kind of helps. The policymakers want to invest in something that is in the headlines. And you can see it even in Finland now that the games industry is not like the buzzword anymore. There's less support for the industry because of that. Like, it's there is a connection. However, it doesn't necessarily work like that. Like in France, the reason why the French were the first ones to build the support instruments for games industry was just because they wanted the French culture to dominate digital sphere. And the games are culture, so they invested in games, even though the French games industry was big, but not that big at the time. Then in some other countries, the motivation comes just from the fact that there are people, there are entrepreneurs who are willing to work in the sector, and then they have incubators and all these SME support structures there to support them. So if there is enough people working in the same direction, some governments are investing and supporting them because there is demand for it. So it's you should not think it in a way that you first have to have a success story to actually have public support. It helps, but it's not like absolutely necessary. And something on the BizDev side that has really helped in many countries is to have this kind of, for example, one of my colleagues who is now working for the Finnish Association of Game Developers as this kind of investor contact person and publisher contact person, matching studios with publishers and investors. She has also been helping the companies with their pitch decks and so on. She used to work on the local level in two cities, in Oulu, up north, nearby the Polar Circle, where you have Fingersoft nowadays, for example, and then in Tampere, in the southern part of the Finland. And her only job was to actually talk with the people, push them to become entrepreneurs, like have this kind of mindset. Like instead of talking games as a culture, really starting like, okay, have a business plan. Explain to me how you are going to make money with this game. So having just this kind of one employee in one project in a city can make a difference. Because if you are pushing the mindset of the developers to more to this direction, if there is someone who is really pushing them against the wall and saying like, look, you have to run a business here, you have to make money with this game, how are you going to do it? That is already changing the attitude step by step. And unfortunately, sometimes it requires one bankruptcy, and then you have tried to make your dream game, and then you start your second company, and that's usually the moment when you actually start to focus a little bit more on the making money part, and less on making your big dream become true. But yeah, so having an incubator, having an accelerator, having this kind of dedicated person who is only there to push the industry to bit more on this kind of investment direction might be helpful. And it also has helped enormously with the Finnish industry that we have one person who has been building the relationships with the investors in the United States, in China, in Korea for more than 2 decades now. If you have this kind of contact person and you are investing it long enough, it of course attracts money to the community because, well, they can make good matches with the publishers and investors. So yeah, you need to usually some kind of association side or then the public sector side export support. And yeah, also what has played a really big role in a number of countries is trade missions. So the way Supercell, for example, got the grasp on the free-to-play business model was actually that they went to Gamescom, where they met German studios who had went to G-Star in South Korea. So the German studios learned from the South Korean browser games that there is this free-to-play business model. Then they introduced it on online side, and that led to the situation where the Finnish studios copied that from in Gamescom to the mobile side of it. So yeah, don't stay in Latvia, go to Gamescom, go to GDC, G-Star, talk with the people, learn from there, see what is happening. Yeah, some insights. Let's continue.
Hello. Maybe not a question, but just an observation. So there's a situation in our country that quite a few people, instead of creating company in Latvia, they just open a website from Estonia and register a company in Estonia. Less taxes, easier and faster, and they just create these solo developer companies because why not? And maybe that's why some numbers might look strange. And another thing, there was an observation that, and yeah, Latvians are a bit individualistic and shy, and we lack that CEO gene because we can see that there's a lot of companies but not many developers. That means there's a lot of solo developers just trying their own thing, and we might be lacking, leadership because we don't really have places where we can educate ourselves as well as the grants. So I don't know, just observations.
Yeah, and that also comes from the game education. Like if you have an incubator connected with a game education institution, that's usually a great place to learn team building, and that's the model from Game Academy in Berlin. That during your studies you start to cooperate with coders, cooperate with graphic designers cooperate with game developers and so on, so game designers. So that way you learn already while you are studying to actually cooperate with people from the different disciplines. And if you have your first startups happening already at that point, it kind of works out more on Cooper spirit. But at the same time, it's also something that I would say is quite normal nowadays, that you have small teams. It's quite rare to have this kind of big teams in the industry anymore, and let's see what will happen to them at the moment. But it's like, it's a very hit-driven, unpredictable industry, so smaller teams, smaller risks. That's also true. And the Estonian comment, absolutely true, and that's one of the biggest challenges we are having at the moment in the data collection, is that more and more people are actually working cross-border remotely. So if, for example, in Finland, there are a number of people working for the US-based companies that have any presence in Finland. So it's becoming more and more difficult to actually track who is the employer of the people at the moment. And that's definitely a huge challenge for the future. And thank you for making a point about Estonia, because of course in Finland we don't see that effect. But that might be very much the case also here in Latvia. So that's definitely something I have to check from my Estonian colleagues, that how many Latvians you actually have in your registers. Any other comments? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for coming here. You had a slide in your presentation regarding like the government funding compared to the loans, grants, and etc. So I wanted to kind of ask, how do other countries handle grants? Do they, for example, with gaming, do they put it together with art and culture, or they have like a separated, dedicated fund or something like that to grant these, grants and loans? And I mean, my personal opinion, I think, with games, they should be more or less, in the private sector. There shouldn't be like any government influence. But it seems that, for example, with Norway, which you mentioned, it seems that they have some sort of a success when they had, decent government support. So maybe you could comment on that.
So first of all, one of the biggest structural problems of the European games industry is the fact that European state aid rules determine that you have to separate R&D funding from the cultural funding. So you can have support instruments that are dedicated for technological development or business model development, but those instruments cannot support the actual production or content creation. Then you have the cultural instruments that can focus on the content creation, but cannot and are not allowed to focus on the tech development. And games being a combination of artistic content, technological innovations, and novel business models, this doesn't really make sense. So that's the first where you start to see these silos. And when we go to the grants, loans, and tax credits, and equity, and that kind of things, it depends completely from a country. Like, for example, here in France, none of these funding instruments have been created for games industry. They have been originally created for film industry, because French government wanted to secure that there are lots of French films. So then the games industry support instruments have been built on top of those instruments. And that you can see these kind of traditions in different countries. So in France you have more governmental institutions handling the funding, whereas Norwegian Film Fund you mentioned is more this kind of semi-autonomous organization. Then especially on R&D side, usually the way to equity funding, for example, works is that there is this kind of fund of funds that are only supporting private investors. So if the private investor is setting up of, let's say, 20 million euro fund for games, then the government will place 20 million on top of that. And then it's very much driven by the business interest. So each of these instruments have their merits and approaches. I think the strength of the Europe is the diversity. So we are trying everything here in the different countries. But each of them also have their weaknesses. Like direct governmental focus, especially on the cultural side, always comes a bit of, you want to support the artistic side, and there is less interest for this kind of simple games making. Yeah, exactly. And whereas then this kind of private investors, well, they want to make money. and there are this kind of really important cultural products that you need for the industry, because someone has to push the boundaries on the cultural side. Someone has to take the risk, make those games that only other game developers play and learn from those, like how to do these things. For example, first VR games, they were often created with public sector grants, because most of the games, when you've played them, where this virtual sickness was a real issue to have to overcome. And they become market ready only in like 5 or 6 years after the first initial public investment on them. So not all parts of the industries are ready, especially the pioneering parts for the private sector side. But at the same time, the public side has lots to learn from the private sector. And one of the key things you can learn from the Finnish instruments is that actually their people who are handling the grants in Business Finland, they are present in Gamescom, they are present in GDC and so on. So they are actually there with the key developers, they are there inside the community. So they kind of understand what is going on in the industry. They are not sitting behind the desk. But of course, every now and then someone asks, like, why are we sending these public officials with the tax money to GDC or Gamescom? But that actually makes lots of sense, because there they learn on how the industry is working.
Maybe can I elaborate a bit on my last point? Yeah, first of all, my game is kind of story-driven. That's why my question was like that, about, you know, connecting it maybe with government and arts. And looking at Latvia, over the last few years, we've had an abundance of like new films and TV shows, and they seem to have some sort of, you know, I think, government funding. So I think maybe one potential solution would be to maybe focus on like the more story-driven games, and games which also, you know, are more like almost an art form rather than just like a leisure activity. So I think maybe that could be a way to attract, you know, the government.
Yeah, if you have policymakers who think like the French policymakers and really value the Latvian culture and its presence in the digital space, then absolutely. But that of course depends a lot from the different situations in the different countries, like which kind of government you have. And usually like the Portuguese are at the moment lobbying for their first cultural tax credit. And they are expecting it to take 3 or 4 years to get it through, and they are really afraid the government chasing between because of the priorities might change. But for example, Italians got their funding instrument through, Belgians have now a tax shelter, so it's completely doable, and you have so many success stories all around Europe at the moment. It's really easy to benchmark this kind of cultural instruments, how they work in the different countries if you are going that route. But at the same time, there are other routes as well, like you can go for R&D, equity instruments or loans, and focus a bit more on business development. And in ideal case, you have both, but unfortunately there are very few countries who are doing that. Are we running out of time?
Yeah, I think we can move on. But are you gonna be here for a few more minutes?
Yeah, well, I have to leave for the flight in about 1 hour.
Okay, so if you have any more questions, he's here for 1 hour and he's leaving our country. So a bit of applause again, and thank you for coming over here.